Well, hello again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back for the final time aboard RMS Titanic. You're now looking not at the famous staircase that we all know from the movie, but the aft first class main stairwell, which is slightly less ornate, but no less impressive. This is actually in the restaurant reception room on B deck, which it fills a similar function to the reception room down on D deck, although this particular one is for the slightly more exclusive specialty restaurants on board. There would probably have been a piano in here. It's not depicted, but to allow for the orchestra, a trio of the orchestra, it's usually not the full ensemble, to play in here ahead of various meal times. But we can move into some of the reasons why this room is particularly notable. It leads to two very famous spaces on board, the first of which is the Café Parisien, designed by Harlan and Wolff to sort of look like a French sidewalk cafe. This particular restaurant was served by authentic French waiters, as White Star enthusiastically advertised. The waiters were actually Italian. I guess the company was just sort of hoping that the rich British and American tourists wouldn't notice. This first class was primarily tourists or people traveling for business rather than immigrating, certainly, so it's much more of a recreational thing. And also, I guess the idea that many of these folks would be more ignorant of the even various demographics of Europeans. I don't know. But we have gorgeous sea views in here. If these windows were open, you could get salty sea breezes blowing through this restaurant. There's ivy growing up these trellises and whatnot. This is the china pattern used through all three of the specialty restaurants on board, with the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company logo there on one side. But this room was very popular. It didn't exist on Olympic, but one was added to Olympic after Titanic's maiden voyage. This space was actually an open, enclosed first-class promenade. All of B-Deck was, wrapping all the way around. But the a la carte restaurant through there, and this restaurant, and then a whole bunch of suites on this deck were added in order to increase some of the appeal of first-class accommodations aboard Titanic. This is a little coat nook for your coats. And in here is the a la carte restaurant under the management of Luigi Gatti. This functioned similar to the Ritz restaurant that was on a couple of German liners at the turn of the 20th century. And some passengers in their accounts even refer to this restaurant as the Ritz, although it was not operated by the Ritz-Carlton. You can see there's a bar here. This was a restaurant with an extra fare. You had to pay more to dine in here, although if you chose to eat only in here, exclusively in the restaurant, the dining saloon fee would be removed from your ticket, the cost of your ticket. So you could pick that option if you wanted. But this was a much more exclusive environment. The Wideners, a wealthy Philadelphia family, hosted a party in here on the night of the 14th of April, attended by Captain Smith, although he left early to go back to the bridge. But this is one of my favorite spaces on board this restaurant here. It's an environment that you didn't get anywhere else. Although it's funny, there's these tables that are clearly set up for a larger party, and then somewhere around here there's a table that's just one chair and it's like angled directly at the wall. I'm gonna see if I can find it. I don't know where it went. But anyway, there's some much more intimate, I guess you could say, dining arrangements. But again, when I down in the second class and third class dining saloons, those long tables with about a dozen passengers or more at one table setting, it's quite a contrast from this. There'd be a cashier in here, so if you just walked in at any time, you could dine in here. There wasn't a set dining time like there was in the saloons, so you could just walk in like a modern restaurant. And then there were reservations. Some of them are listed in this book. And let me zoom in here. There's some rather conspicuous names here, although for some reason it appears that Rose and Ruth DeWitt Bucater are dining 20 minutes apart. No, an hour and 40 minutes. I can't read. Apart. That's a little odd. Margaret Brown. John Astor. And then Madeline Astor appears to have cancelled. I wasn't aware that there was some beef between those two. Moving right along, I have to scroll all the way back out so that we're not zoomed in uncomfortably far. Leaving the restaurant, we can begin to head into some of the cabins on this deck, and let me just check to make sure I'm on the right side of the ship. I am. We're heading to B81, which, while I don't know that we have a listed occupant for it, it is the first example of a Louis XVI style cabin, which of course is all of this inlay wood in very nice satisfying patterns. This is a very warm cabin. There's some that are much more airy in feel. This is a cozier room. I wonder what they're reading. I'd zoom in to try to read it, but then it would take forever. Leaving number 81, which again I think was unoccupied, so I wonder whose book that is. We can head to a hallway here to get across the ship, because on the port side is cabin B58, which will be our next stop. I think it's fairly far forward, if I remember right. Here it is. So this is another Louis XVI style. That seems wrong. Well, it's listed as Louis XVI, but I think this is actually clearly a different style. Perhaps my cabin arrangement plan is incorrect, but regardless, this cabin was occupied by Mr. Quig Baxter, who was a Canadian athlete, and by this time I believe he was a hockey coach, a somewhat successful hockey coach. He carried his mother and sister to a lifeboat on the night of the sinking. I don't know if they were all in this room, or if this was just his, but Mr. Baxter, did not survive the night, and I don't know that we ever identified what happened to him. His body was never identified. More stained glass panels over the windows here. And this wallpaper, I believe it's wallpaper, is very shiny. If this room was on the other side of the ship, we'd have daylight pouring in here, and the whole look of this room would be entirely different. We're kind of in the shaded side at the moment. But leaving B58, now go to B57, which is on the other side of the ship. This is going to be one of the spaces in a parlor suite. Oh, wait, no it's not. B57, okay, so B57 was a modern Dutch style cabin. This cabin and the two adjacent, so 59 and 63, which were Old Dutch, and Modern Dutch, respectively. These rooms were all occupied by the Arthur and Emily Ryerson family, and their 3 children, Emily, John, and Suzette. They also brought a maid with them, Victorin Schoudenson, I believe is how you pronounce her last name. The entire family, with the exception of Arthur, made it off Titanic, including the maid. But I don't know if she stayed in one of these cabins or if she was booked somewhere else. But regardless, these cabins were actually heavily photographed, either by the shipyard or a publicity firm. And there's a very famous photograph. I think it might be from one of these chairs, because I feel like it's kind of at this angle here, looking toward the 4-poster, here in cabin 59. But these rooms are gorgeous. More stained glass. This one is patterned stained glass over this window here. The dark woods in here are very nice. You can head out of this, and there's lots of places on the ship like this where I can point out that you could open these doors to make conjoining cabins like this into a larger suite. I don't know how far they go, but you can see there's another door here, and it could extend a significant portion of the SeaDeck cabin block. I think it ends there because on the other side is the parlor suite, which we can head into now. B51, 53, 55 was the starboard. Yeah, the starboard parlor suite. And this one, there were 2, one on this side, one on the port side. The port side one was again occupied by J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line. This one, which is identical in layout but not in style to the one that was depicted as the Cal and Rose suite in the movie. This one was occupied by Charlotte Cardeza, who was traveling with her son Thomas and their maid, Anna Ward, on their way to Germantown, Pennsylvania. She was a very wealthy American. I don't remember what her husband did, but she was quite well off. So this would be on the other side of the ship anyway, but this is the couch, the drawing couch, or at least a copy of it. The sitting room here, you've got a writing desk. You could have guests here to your cabin during the crossing if you wish, and entertain. There were personal butlers provided for these suites, so you could definitely host a party in here if you wanted to. These lace coverings over the windows separate this sitting room from the, whoops, there's a tree, private promenade immediately outside. This is about a 50-foot, I'm standing in all the trees accidentally here, a 50-foot in length, private, not quite exterior deck that you could open these windows if you wanted to. With a gorgeous view of the sea, get some air, get some strolling in without the inconvenience of other passengers existing. If you were the wealthiest on board, you see all sorts of deck chairs and things. You could take meals in here if you wanted, because again, you could order things directly to your cabin throughout the ship, but especially in first class. Those double doors lead to the first class boarding entrances, which we'll see in a moment. So if you were particularly wealthy, you could step on board and be directly in your cabin. And then attached to the sitting room is one of several bedrooms, and there'd be bathrooms and things, and a walk-in closet, and I think a pantry directly attached to this millionaire suite, as it was known. This is the Italian Renaissance style, and the wood, even this type of digital environment doesn't quite do this wood justice. It had a shine to it that's almost impossible to describe. But this gives you an idea of what this cabin would have looked like. It's one of those types of spaces that you almost don't want to touch anything, because it's such a weird room, but I don't think I'd be able to relax in here, but it's so pretty. Pull down screens there. Very detailed pattern. A marble vanity in here. But leaving this suite, one of these marble mantelpieces here, James Cameron in his 2005 expedition. So in addition to making the movie, he's done a lot for the actual exploration and expansion of knowledge about the wreck and the sinking process of Titanic and her stories. He sent a little robot on a tether in here, and we have footage of or maybe it was the room on C deck, but we have close-up footage of these mantelpieces, one of them, the clock still on top. I think it was this one, but I could be wrong. Heading into the B-deck landing of the first-class main staircase, the forward one that is. A couple of interesting things attached to or in this foyer. The private promenade is right through there, and this is one of the boarding points for first-class passengers. So there'd be a gangway attached to here. The private promenade and this adjacent entrance are remnants of what was once an Olympic, at least, and wraparound first-class promenade on B-deck that was cut up to make into multiple spaces, including this one and the one next to it, and then the restaurants further aft. But as you can see, it's a much grander first impression than the other two classes. You walk in and this is what you see. These we've seen throughout first class spaces. These are heaters. You can see there's heat radiating off of this thing. I think it's electric, and that's probably how you turn it on down there on the side. You can smoke on Titanic, but not everywhere. Now, we saw a second-class elevator in an earlier part of the tour, but this is the first-class elevator car, and you can tell just by how much gold and mirrors and things that are in here, how much craftsmanship went into even the elevators on board this ship. Manufacturer's label there. They are Waygood and Company, outside of London. Alright, so moving further up, we can proceed excuse me, to A deck. We're getting very high in the ship now. More of these potentially placeholder paintings, I don't know. We're going to head forward here for a moment and take a look at two cabins, numbers 3 and 4 on A deck. These were both, in an earlier version of this program, unfurnished, and I don't know that we know who stayed in these. There may not have been an occupant that could have traveled empty. Up there on that shelf, I think, if I remember right, in some of the other cabins, those shelves that you saw, even in third-class cabins, and now here in first, was either for life jackets, or maybe the life jackets were kept in the wardrobe. I don't know. It would make sense for there to be a shelf like that in every cabin, then, if that was where the life jackets were kept. In here is a standard first-class gentleman's lavatory. You got the row of sinks there. It's a little bit nicer than the one we saw for stewards, although the steward's restroom was considerably larger because there were more of them. They want to make sure that you're not flushing things you're not supposed to be flushing. So, some things never change. Oh, there's a view forward. Does this cabin have a better view? Ah, from the writing desk, yeah. The foremast, out over the forecastle. The bridge is above us. But, oh, here's Here's an extended Pullman berth. We were seeing those all over the ship. Here's one if it's, like, folded into its position for use. We're going to head further aft. I believe. Yes. Through this revolving door here. Let me check. Interesting. Could have sworn there was something in my notes here that I had, but I must have removed it. So here's the reading and writing room. There were, after dinner, 2 spaces that were, at least unofficially, segregated by gender. And this was the space where predominantly women would retire after dinner. Functioned similarly to a library, although there's no bookcase in here. But you could do your letter writing and your postcard writing and things of that nature in here. Or just find a chair with a book. And there's a fireplace in here as well. This space was not as popular as White Star intended. And eventually on Olympic and in the design for Britannic, although it was never implemented aboard Britannic, because she sank as a hospital ship during the war, never sailed as a liner. This alcove was eventually removed from the reading and writing room aboard Olympic and turned into cabins, because it was not an economically used space if this room was not as popular, so they just put a wall here and turned that into something else. You see there's palm planters and things in here, these big bay windows that look out onto the A-deck promenade, and some windows that peek just barely out to the boat deck above. Because this is when I was talking about raised roofs while we were on the exterior second class promenade. The ceilings here are higher than elsewhere on the ship because that roof is above the boat deck level by a couple of feet, so it gives us added height in a lot of these public rooms on A deck. In here is the first class lounge, one of the grandest rooms on board, graced with a mahogany bookcase and this enormous chandelier, this blown glass chandelier, and a marble mantelpiece with a replica of the statue Artemis of Versailles. I apologize, the mirrors are a little wonky in this version still, but there's Artemis there at our fireplace. This room functioned kind of as a reading room and a place to socialize. You could take tea and coffee in here. There were some bays along the edges to provide for some privacy, at least. So you got kind of little alcoves in here, so if you wanted to have a little board game or a conversation that's a little more isolated, perhaps, you could do it in one of these. The upper portions of the windows that peek out onto the boat deck in this room are stained glass, and then there's smaller chandeliers along the exterior. A lot of these light sconces on the walls were recovered from the debris field. Then you could check out some of these books if you wanted from the steward that was stationed in this room. You could bring it to your cabin to read. This room was very heavily damaged during the breakup, but the paneling in here aboard Olympic was auctioned off when Olympic was scrapped, and this room is reconstructed almost as it would have looked in a hotel and pub in Alnwick, England, the White Swan. So this room, as it was aboard Olympic, Olympic's Lounge, still exists. You can go visit it. There's a piano in there. They have events. So it's kind of neat that at least one of the Olympic class lounges does still exist. Over here you got a candy cupboard. There's no candy in it. Someone must have eaten it all already. Curses. But if you need some candy, they'd have some. I don't know if you'd have to pay for it, or if you could just come up and grab the candy, or how it would work. It's definitely high enough that children couldn't reach it, so that was probably deliberate. We can head further aft to the upper landing. Get through this revolving door here. They take a little bit. The upper landing of the aft staircase. We saw these in the officer's deck house, but I don't think I pointed one out since, despite the fact that throughout the upper decks, these gold-plated expansion joints are here again to allow the ship to flex in high seas. Here's the upper landing of the aft staircase, graced by this wrought iron dome and a beaded chandelier at the center. While this clock is not as ornate as the forward one, we'll see in a bit. There's a clock furnished here as well. This staircase again was completely obliterated and spat out as the ship came apart. And in here, I believe, I don't know if this is A36 or A37, but this cabin belonged to Thomas Andrews, the manager of the drafting department at Harlan and Wolff Shipbuilding in Belfast. He was not quite the mastermind behind the Olympic class, but certainly an integral figure in their development, and was on board the maiden voyage to make notes for potential improvements and observe the ship's performance. So that's what he was doing aboard. Frosted windows out to the promenade for privacy so that nobody can go peeping in and see too much. You can see he's got plans scattered all over the place. And then on the other side of the stairs is a nearly identical cabin, but this one was occupied. And I think there was a bathroom for each cabin, just through this door here, so they had their own bathrooms, essentially. A priest in training, Francis Brown, later became a priest, Father Brown. He's in the process of becoming a saint. Whatever procedure they have at the Vatican to make that happen is underway. Or no. Sorry, that was a different one. That was the second-class passenger, Father Biles. Father Brown survived the sinking. He wasn't even on board during the sinking because he boarded at Southampton and left at, I believe, Cherbourg in France. So he was only on board for a day or two, but he brought his camera. This little camera right here. And took a whole bunch of photographs of the ship. And his photographs are pretty much all of the only photographs we have aboard Titanic. The rest of the photographs, the many photographs that you'll see that are said to be of Titanic, are actually Olympic. Almost universally. But there's a photograph that was clearly taken from the vanity of this cabin, pointed in this direction of the dressing table and the wicker chair. So they've set it up as though this camera has only just taken the photo. But Brown got off at Cherbourg, took his camera with him, and the rest is history. So now, we can head even further aft. Doors out to the promenade. There are these stained glass windows looking into the first class smoke room. So like the reading and writing room was for women after dinner, the smoke room was intended for the use of the men. This room was open very late in the evening, I think later than all of the other public rooms, perhaps until 11 or midnight, maybe later. But you could have brandy in here, you'd play cards, you could smoke cigarettes or cigars or whatever would make your heart content. There's spittoons everywhere in here as well. A lot of armchairs and these sofas around the only actual fireplace on board. This was the only one that wasn't electric. It was a coal-fired fireplace here. And this smoke was vented up like we saw when we were upstairs, topside, vented up through the number 4 funnel, the casing for which is right in here, in this box. And there's actually a light shaft that comes down through here. You can see light a little bit. It sort of illuminates these windows, and there's a passage that goes around in there. I think there's even a bathroom through these doors. So this is even usable space in there surrounding the funnel casing. The painting above the mantle, this marble mantelpiece here, is Plymouth Harbor. There were 2 paintings done by the same artist for both Olympic and Titanic. This one, Plymouth Harbor, shows what I think is a Cressy class or a Booker class battle cruiser of the Royal Navy. The other, aboard Olympic, was Approach to New York, so it was a painting of New York Harbor with an ocean liner on its way in. These were recreated based on... We may even have either a photograph or other earlier reproductions of these paintings. So that would be how this came to exist, this color image of that painting. There was a bar in here that serviced this room, so passengers could have whatever it is they wished to drink as they discussed politics and business and other things, scones and things. Tea and coffee could be made available. And this pantry would service both the smoke room through here, this little window, so stewards could come and get things and pass them out. Little cinnamon rolls, it appears, and there's, of course, brandy and whiskey and wines and all sorts of fun things. Tea and coffee. Drawer full of mugs, teacups. You can buy replicas of this tea set, or originals, but generally from Olympic or other White Star liners in the period, because it would have all been the same. And then there's a safe for the money, because you'd have to buy the drinks. They don't just arrive. But it wouldn't really be a problem for the people that were in the smoke room, of course, because they have plenty of money. But again, this pantry, and there's a steward call box, so this would indicate where in the smoke room somebody needs something, because there's call buttons at various places throughout the room, so then they know where to go. Oh, there's a fire axe. Just in case someone's being a particularly obnoxious customer. And then in the far end here is the Veranda and Palm Court Cafe, which was actually 2 rooms, one on each side of the ship. This was serviced by the same pantry. You could get small meals and things here. It was a specialty restaurant with, I believe it was serviced by the same kitchen as the a la carte restaurant and the Café Parisien. The door to that galley, we actually passed on our way to the second class exterior promenade the other day. I think I mentioned it was the first and second class galley. That was incorrect. It was the restaurant galley, which was a deck above the first and second class galleys. There were 2 of these rooms. One was a cafe, and the other was primarily used, we believe, as a children's playroom during the crossing, because Titanic didn't have one of those. At least, not one officially. So perhaps one of the other cafe rooms, because the other one I don't think you could access directly from inside. Or maybe that was this one, because there was only a crew door and not for passengers. So they put the playroom in here, because the only way to get to it would be through these sliding doors outside. But, speaking of outside, we will head there now to the exterior first class promenade, which there's a loading screen here. This will be some of the last spaces we have to cover, I believe. Here we are, the aft first class promenade. We could see this space from the second class promenade above, at the boat deck level, the other day. But this would have been the space available to first class. The veranda and palm courts are both on either side there through sliding doors, and you could see down over the lower second class promenade, see the entrance there, and the two third class promenades and the poop deck there. And gorgeous sea views, the mainmast rising above us. For a second I thought that bit of cloud was the moon. I was going to be really excited. In here is a fan room. So we've seen some heaters and fans elsewhere, but they had rooms scattered like this throughout the ship. And through that frosted window there, that's the second class stairway. We looked through the other side of that window in an earlier part of the tour. And then here's a better look at the electric cranes for cargo. You actually have to go up on there to operate it. You can see the levers and things. And then I think there's a hatch somewhere in here to get in to work on the actual equipment inside that moves it. There's a very famous photograph, a Father Brown photograph taken on this deck right about here, of two passengers, a man and a woman, out for a stroll, all bundled up. Would have been taken probably the 12th. And then there's a famous photograph of a boy spinning a toy top over there on the deck, facing forward in that direction with his top all extended on a string. And then we will go up the starboard side of the A-deck first class promenade, which runs between 500 and 600 feet of the ship's length here, with various points, entrances to public rooms along its length. There's deck chairs here. Stewards could come out here and bring hot tea or soup or bouillon, coffee perhaps. There'd be blankets and cushions available, and you'd have to rent one of these from the purser's office to reserve your spot. Oh, there's cabins in here. So they want people that were strolling in the early morning to not go further forward of here, to avoid making a whole bunch of racket and waking people up. And there's stairs up to the boat deck level there. The lounge is through the windows on the left. And this is the open part of the promenade. On Olympic, this point I'm going further aft. On Olympic, the entire A-deck promenade was like this, where there's this huge gap, a bulwark to prevent you from tipping over the side, handrail. It's all open. Titanic enclosed the forward end like this, so there were windows here. And originally the lifeboats were intended to be lowered to the A-deck level and then launched, after they were filled with people here at this deck, rather than doing so up at the boat deck, which is predominantly what ended up happening. Primarily because in order to open these windows you need a crank for them, and for the duration of the sinking they couldn't find the crank. So some of these forward boats lowered down to A deck in preparation for taking on more passengers, and then sat there for a while because no one could get the windows open. They did eventually find the crank and everything was squared away, but it just sort of shows the not quite lack of preparedness, but the fact that everything was so rushed led to some interesting scenarios. I don't remember which number boat it was that sat, like, right out here. Maybe it was on the other side, but point stays the same. There's this door here to even further enclose this promenade in the event that it's storming. This staircase goes up to the bridge. It's closed now. Nice view forward from the well deck, forecastle. And then the bridge is directly above us. The daylight playing on the ground. And then we're gonna go, running into walls here, around and enter the first class forward entrance on the port side. Because there's a handful of spaces, not many, left to see. Here's the door. Again, this is the first class bit, so it may take a moment to load. Get another nice view of the Café Parisien in the meantime. Alright, so now we're here in this little vestibule, entrance vestibule from the promenade. And in here is arguably, in one of the official streams, Matt and Kyle, modelers and programmers at Vintage Digital Revival, sort of pointed out that this very well could be the most famous staircase in history. And it's hard to argue with that. Like, the other ideas that come to mind, like the Spanish Steps in Rome, perhaps, Stairway to Heaven, but there's not a whole lot of staircases that you can show most people and they know immediately what they're looking at. That's Titanic. And a lot of that's from the movie, but I think even before then, there's not a whole lot more iconic. Up here, the clock, the sculpture around it, here on the forward staircase. Honor and glory, crowning time. I don't know which one's honor and which one's glory, but they are doing the crowning. This was a cast iron, framed, frosted glass dome with another beaded chandelier at the center. Appears to be off at the moment. This was not, as depicted in the movie, back illuminated at night, so it would have been kind of dark. The chandelier would be on, but the dome itself wasn't illuminated from behind. But it's one of the most famous rooms ever put to sea. Above, on the boat deck level, there's a couple of things. There's a piano here, so we think, at least at first, this is probably where the orchestra would play during the sinking, or were playing during the sinking. They may be moved outside later, but this was probably where they started playing. And we don't know if that was under orders, or if they just sort of did it on their own accord to prevent a panic. forward here, there's a handful of first-class staterooms. You can see the pneumatic tubes passing around us, and then the officers' quarters is forward of that door. But in here, the elevators are directly below us. So this is the machinery space for those elevators. There's a sink in here if you get grease all over your hands while working on them. Little teeny skylights passing through to the sun deck above. Also on the boat deck level, inside, you can see lifeboats out there, was the gymnasium, which is kind of an interesting place because there's a few things we'd recognize. There's a rowing machine, a punching bag, which I can actually ram my face into, it appears. We have bicycles here that you can try your hand at racing. The indicator here will tell you who's winning in yards because we were still using Imperial units even on British ships. But then there's really strange things. There's this thing, which I don't remember which one this is. It either vibrates or it's like a core rotator, so you'd sit on it and it would twist you, which sounds painful, but perhaps it's for stretching. I don't know what this does. I really don't. It probably vibrates. There's the back rubber. So you lay on it, and it has little arms with spindly things on it to rub your back, which isn't creepy at all. And then there's this thing that you just sort of stand in, and to be honest, I don't remember what it does to you. But it's probably some form of massage-like thing. The gymnasiums, especially since a lot of this equipment was designed by the same strange man, had similar but not quite the same purpose in 1912. A lot of this was kind of novelty-like. This we would recognize. This you pull on the handles here and it lifts the weights at the base. So that's normal-ish. And then there's the electric horse and the electric horse and the electric camel, which to my knowledge all that you'd sit on it and it would move like a horse is moving. Which was a novelty thing. There's some photographs of a lady passenger and a member of the Guarantee Group, some of Thomas Andrews's Harlan and Wolff inspectors, riding one of these. Kind of a novelty thing. But this is a very airy space with daylight pouring in. It looks like they're still installing some of these shades over the windows. There's a map. Another one of these maps, the first class one. We've seen two in second and third class already. And then there's this illuminated cutaway panel of the Olympic class steamers to give some perspective. Try not to trip on the rowing machine there. There's the gymnasium hours. Thomas Macaulay was the instructor. He was on board. He did not survive. During the sinking, he was still in here showing passengers how to use the rowing machine and whatnot. And actually, at one point, the Astors, John and Madeline Astor, came in here, the richest couple on the ship. And John was cutting open a life jacket to show Madeline, to let her know that it's just cork or something in there. She must have been somewhat unnerved by it, using it as a lifeline, and wanted to make sure that she knew what it was, I guess. He was cutting it open with a penknife, and that happened in this room. So now we can actually, for the last time I believe, step back outside to the first class boat deck promenade. In a moment, at least. Here we are. So now we're on the boat deck. Out on the boat deck. This is where, literally where, so much of the drama of April 15th, 1912 took place. Families torn apart. Bravery and cowardice. An epic worthy of Greek plays over the course of 2.5 hours. Basically written itself, or written by itself. All took place here, on the boat deck. Forward, aft, port, and starboard. There's a compass platform here, mounted in the center of the ship, away from metal, because it's a magnetic compass. Go up here, take a look at the view. So it's up here because it's in the middle of the ship. It's relatively stable, and again, so the metal of the hull and the superstructure doesn't mess with the compass reading. And this way, you could take a reading from this compass and the binnacles on the bridge and sort of triangulate your whereabouts from that. But in all likelihood, the orchestra played either port or starboard just outside the first class entrance here, because this is the gymnasium on the right, or on the left, and then the first class entrance is right here. "705 people made it into the boats. Perhaps 706, the number. Different sources have different numbers, precisely how many were saved. 1,500 people were lost when Titanic sank, out of the 2,200 aboard. Most of them who remained on board the ship in the final moments headed aft to the best of their ability. This is the engineer's promenade. There's steps down, more fans and things. The officer's mess is in there. I'm heading aft briefly here. So we've already seen these spaces, but in the final moments, as the ship's list became more and more pronounced, everyone headed here, to the fantail. Clustered near the steps down there, Father Biles, a second-class passenger, clung to the rail, gave absolution to hundreds. Crew members in all three classes alike. As the list grew ever more pronounced, his flock, unable to remain standing, began to slip away. The ship broke up between the third and fourth funnel. The lounge, the smoke room, the a la carte restaurant, the aft staircase, the third class forward dining saloon, the aft portion of the first class dining saloon, the galleys were completely shredded. The forward section sank quickly at that point. The aft section remained afloat for just a few more minutes. Perhaps emergency lights came on, perhaps not. We're still unsure. There are, at the moment at least, very few ways to experience what it's like to walk the decks of Titanic. This is one of them. And while it's not perfect, obviously, it certainly does Titanic justice in a way that's difficult to accomplish any other way. The film comes close, visually, and remains stunning, but there's something about just wandering on Titanic that is unique and impressive. But I think we'll head to the bridge where we started for the very end of our tour here. I do hope it was at least somewhat informative and wasn't too, didn't drag on too much, although I imagine those who were particularly bored out of their mind may have left already, and that's perfectly fine, because I tend to ramble, and Titanic is an extremely large ship. But I wanted to, for this anniversary week, truly give as much of a rundown of what Titanic was and what her people may have experienced day to day as I could, and this was the best way to do that. Again, I've mentioned this a couple of times before, but if you'd like to download the virtual environments, they are available, at least this version is available for free at www.titanichg.com. So you can head over there and do some exploring yourself. You'll undoubtedly find places or views that I didn't. And there's always new things to see on a ship this big. But I think we will leave it there. I want to thank everybody who may have stuck it out for coming along on this tour with me. It's been a privilege to have you on board. And hopefully this is just one little element of keeping the story of this ship and the 2,200 people who lived and died aboard her alive in some minute capacity. Thank you much, have a fantastic day, and I'll figure something out to do next year. Thanks, everybody.